Rock-a-bye, you be in the deep sea. When the wind blows, resistant you'll be. When earthquake hits, your HP will fall, and I will return you to your beast ball. Sweet dreams, Ophelia.
Oh, so Moan can treat a Nihilego like his daughter, but I can't?
If you are fortunate enough to have ever been in a Discord server with me, you might notice that my profile picture on there is a Nihilego. You might wonder why that is. Well, the simple answer is, Nihilego is my favorite Pokemon ever of all time. I've owned and commonly used a Nihilego in every single game where it's catchable, and in Pokemon Go, my avatar is wearing the limited edition Nihilego hat that they distributed during one of their Ultra Beast events. Nihilego is even my lock screen on my cell phone. I've been a huge fan of it ever since I first played Pokemon Sun and Moon, when I was only 15. I'd spend hours feeding and petting my Nihilego in Pokemon Refresh, and when I got Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and finally reached the point where you could go to Ultra Space, the first thing I did after beating Ultra Necrozma was catch a Nihilego and make it a permanent member of my team. I remember when I took a class on video production in high school and they were teaching us how to use green screens, I green screened myself into the Ultra Deep Sea and surrounded myself with Nihilego. I remember that when the first official Nihilego plushie came out in the spring of 2018, I begged my mom to lend me some money so I could buy it because I didn't have a job back then, and she eventually complied and let me order it online. And I'll never forget the day when it finally arrived and I finally got to hold my favorite Pokemon in my arms. It would later get attacked by the family dog, destroying the sheer netting on its head and leaving a rip, but I stitched it up good as new. Speaking of stitching, I made a humanized Nihilego cosplay back when I was 17, and I had a lot of fun wearing it at conventions, meeting up with other humanized Pokemon cosplayers, and terrorizing Guzma cosplayers. And though the overdress and the skirt no longer fit me, I still have the hat. Besides, 6 years later, I would make an even better Nihilego dress that's also just a cute 1950s style dress, so it's no big deal. But my love for Nihilego is hard to explain in a single sentence. There are so many compounding factors contributing to my love of this Pokemon, and I figured that instead of explaining myself over and over and over again in every Pokemon-related video I make, I'd make one long video about how and why this extraterrestrial glass jellyfish has fascinated me for all these years. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you exactly why Nihilego is my favorite Pokemon and maybe convince some of you guys to like this Pokemon a bit more. Oh, and by the way, this video contains spoilers for Pokemon Sun, Moon, Ultra Moon, the Pokemon Sun and Moon anime, and Pokemon Journeys, so if you don't want to have those games and shows spoiled for you, at least in part, maybe go watch something else? Or don't. I don't care. Now, my boyfriend knows very little about Pokemon. He never owned a Nintendo console growing up, so I can't really blame him, but still, that means I've had to be his Pokédex for as long as we've been dating. He's picked up on the names of a handful of them, and he's found a couple that he likes, but even though Nihilego is my favorite Pokemon and I've told him about it multiple times, for the longest time he couldn't remember the name Nihilego. So he usually calls it Jellyfish Lady. And I find that really charming and feel like it illustrates just how well designed Nihilego is. When creating Nihilego, Game Freak had to do 3 things. They had to make it look like an alien life form because the Ultra Beasts are extraterrestrial beings. They had to base it on a real-life invasive species, as the concept of the Ultra Beast was inspired by real-world accounts of invasive species. And they had to make it look traditionally feminine, so that the whole thing about Lusamine dressing her daughter Lily to resemble a Nihilego because Lusamine is obsessed with it and never thinks about anything else doesn't end up too obvious. So they skillfully combined the otherworldly-looking moon jellyfish and the widely invasive Australian spotted jellyfish with a classy young woman in a fancy hat and dress. And best of all, instead of coming across as a person with animal attributes, like, say, Meowscarada, it comes across as an animal with person attributes. It manages to subtly convey the appearance of a human girl without going full Gardevoir. Notice how its lower tentacles look like both a skirt and long hair? Notice how, just like jellyfish, it doesn't even have a face, but its tentacles still frame the place where its face would be? And notice how when it attaches to someone, it makes them look like they're wearing a hat and a long wig? Genius! Perfect subtle design! Now, it's not entirely known whether Nihilego or Lily was designed first. In-universe, it's clear that Nihilego came first and Lily's outfit was chosen to resemble it, but out of universe, no one has ever stated whether they designed Lily first and designed Nihilego to look like her, or whether they designed Nihilego first and designed Lily to be dressed like it. My heart says it's the latter, but if it's the former, I want to prove that it is so much more than just a Lily knockoff. There is so much that went into its design beyond just, it looks like Lily. You may wonder why they chose a jellyfish, an earth animal, as the basis of their alien creature. Shouldn't you want an alien to look like something you've never seen on Earth? Well, funnily enough, because the Earth is so biodiverse, people who design aliens for sci-fi movies and stuff usually take inspiration from creatures on this planet. Insects are especially common for this, hence why Buzzwole and Pheromosa exist. But sea creatures are also commonly used as inspiration when designing aliens. Perhaps it's because of the parallels that can be drawn between space and the ocean, hence why we have terms like spaceship and astronaut, which is Greek for star sailor. Perhaps it's because we're so used to seeing them in the water that seeing them on land or in the air strikes us as unusual. Or perhaps it's just because a lot of sea creatures look really weird. Regardless, there are countless examples of aliens in fiction that resemble sea creatures. Remember Admiral Akbar from Star Wars? The guy who says, "It's a trap!" He's basically an octopus with human-like proportions. H.G. Wells' classic novel, The War of the Worlds, also features cephalopod-like aliens, as the Martians in the book are described as having bulbous heads, beak-like mouths, and 8 tentacles. Space whales have been a recurring thing in science fiction since around the 1970s. H.P. Lovecraft's story, At the Mountains of Madness, features aliens that resemble starfish. Dr. Zoidberg from Futurama is an alien that resembles a lobster. And jellyfish-like aliens are not unheard of in sci-fi, with possibly the most famous example being the titular Metroids from the Metroid series, which, coincidentally enough, are also parasites that attach to the head of their host. So Nihilego being a space jellyfish is not unprecedented in the slightest. Nihilego is also said to be made of glass, hence why it's classified as a rock type, because glass is made of quartz, and quartz is also found in many stones and crystals. This explains why it's bluish-white in color, the color of frosted glass, and why parts of Nihilego's body are transparent. This only adds to its alien nature as it references the idea of silicon-based life. You see, every living thing on Earth contains an element known as carbon. Why carbon? Well, it's abundant, it can form stable bonds with most other elements, and it can form long chains of molecules like proteins and DNA. Silicon, the element that glass, sand, quartz crystals, and most stones are made out of, is in the same group of elements as carbon, the crystallogens, and has many similar properties, including the ability to form long DNA-like chains. So many scientists have speculated that somewhere in the universe, there are creatures whose biology is based around silicon rather than carbon. A lot of sci-fi writers and artists took this and ran with it, creating alien species that are said to be silicon-based rather than carbon-based. And much of the time, they look like they're made of crystals, stone, or something else in our world that contains silicon. Keep in mind this recurring theme of common pop culture alien traits. It'll be important later. Like real jellyfish, Nihilego doesn't have a face, which serves to make it look more otherworldly and even creepy. However, just because it doesn't have a face doesn't mean it's not expressive. As Ursula once said,
"Don't underestimate the importance of body language."
Look at this animation. It pulls down the brim of its hat to cover up its non-existent face, and its knees turn inwards. They managed to find a way to make this faceless jellyfish look afraid. Or look at how its tentacles curl inwards when it gets angry, managing to look like it's putting its non-existent hands on its non-existent hips. Or look at this animation, where it puts its hands together as if clasping them in prayer and wistfully looks up over the player's shoulder. So cute! Look at the little twirl it does when it's happy! Several of the Ultra Beasts, including Nihilego, are masterclasses in how to make something both intimidatingly alien in its design and expressive by human standards. You don't need to slap big cartoony eyes and a wide grin on something to make it come across as a living thing. Also, despite technically being sexless and being an antagonistic force throughout Sun and Moon's story, Nihilego's design is unabashedly feminine and cutesy. It's even stated to act like a young girl in its Pokédex entry from Moon. Now, I am what's classified as a girly girl, and my personal style tends to be a bit juvenile, though what do you expect when I have such a baby face? So I really appreciate Pokemon that look like something you'd see in a 7-year-old girl's lunchbox. However, when cutesy and feminine characters are portrayed as creepy or antagonistic in media, which is rare, they usually go hand in hand with two tropes that personally rub me the wrong way. Either, this character is immature because they're insane, and they're also dangerous because they're insane. Or, what if this thing from your childhood was super messed up? Refreshingly, Nihilego is neither of these, and manages to be an example of a cutesy yet threatening character done right. It's not a twisted version of something nostalgic, or a demonization of a mentally ill person who regresses into childish behaviors to deal with trauma, but an invading alien that just happens to be girly pop. It kicks butt, scares people with its presence, and looks cute doing it. In addition, Nihilego is a poison type. I don't know what it is about poison types, but they just click with me. It's gotta be my favorite type, or at least in my top 3. Though, to be fair, I call myself Mercury, named my cat Belladonna, and my favorite song of all time is literally named Toxic. So maybe the concept of poison just fascinates me. Not in like a serial killer way, though. Even its name is expertly crafted. Nihil is the Latin word for nothing, and it's from this word that we get the terms nihilism and annihilate in English. The second part of its name, ego, also comes from Latin, being that language's first-person singular pronoun, equivalent to I, yo, je, ich, ya, watashi, etc. We get a lot of English words from this word too, like alter ego and egotistical. So its name is basically Latin for I am nothing or I have nothing. This is perfect for Nihilego, considering it's a parasite, something that can't survive on its own and latches onto others to survive. Also, I remember before the anime was dubbed into English, there were a lot of people, including myself, that pronounced its name the Latin way, Nihilego. I even made a ton of puns with its name that only work if you pronounce it that way. It took me a while to adjust to saying Nihilego. Nihilego was my own personal Rayquaza. But it gets better. In Freudian psychology, the ego is the aspect of the mind that governs logical thought and mediates the other two parts of the mind. The superego, which is a collection of internalized critiques based on what is picked up from others in their life, and the id, which is the lizard-brained part of your mind that acts solely on instinct. For example, if you were a Jedi, and you had a Sith Lord unarmed and on his knees with 2 lightsabers crossed near his head, your superego would tell you, you shouldn't kill him, it's not the Jedi way, and your id would tell you, do it! Your ego, therefore, is what allows you to think it over for a few seconds before the Supreme Chancellor insists you should kill the Sith Lord. So, its name may suggest that it has no ego, which makes sense because official sources say it acts primarily on a self-preservation instinct. So it's all id all the time. However, its English name is not its original name, so let's look at its Japanese name, Utsuroido. Fortunately, I minored in Japanese in college. The first part of its name comes from utsuro, which means emptiness or vacancy. Utsurona is also used figuratively to describe a blank expression, which fits with how Nihilego doesn't have a face. It may also incorporate utsuru, meaning to migrate or to move to a new home, referring to how it came to our world from another planet or dimension or whatever the Ultra Deep Sea is classified as. The second part could come from void, id, asteroid, or even humanoid, because it kind of looks like a person. The oid suffix, meaning resembling, is also commonly used in science fiction, probably because it's in the word android. And speaking of science fiction, – many Ultra Beasts are inspired by different portrayals of aliens in media. Guzzlord? The big scary monster from another planet, like King Ghidorah from the Godzilla franchise. Buzzwole? The insect-like alien species, like the bugs from Starship Troopers. Pheromosa? The hot lady alien, like the Twi'leks from Star Wars. Zerkatry? The idea of aliens being bioluminescent in some way, like E.T. Celesteela? Based on Princess Kaguya, the original alien who was sent to Earth as a baby to live among humans and help them, like Superman. Kartana? The idea of aliens having advanced weaponry and being really good at killing people, like the Predators. Stakataka? The extraterrestrial hive mind, like the Borg from Star Trek. Blacephalon? The goofy alien character, like Zim from Invader Zim. Poipole and Naganadal? The alien that acts like a sidekick or pet to a human character, like Stitch from Lilo and Stitch. So, which common alien trope does Nihiligo represent? Simple, the alien parasite. A lot of sci-fi media depicts alien species that are parasitic in nature and are easily able to infect humans despite humans not being native to their homeworld. The most famous example of this has to be the Xenomorphs from the Alien franchise. But while the Xenomorphs are more like real-world parasitoid wasps, using their host as an incubation chamber and first meal for their babies, Nihiligo is more like a Myxozoan or a cordyceps fungus, a parasite that affects the behavior of its host. This is actually one of the most common ways parasites are portrayed in media. Heck, Pokemon has even done it before with Parasect. So, why do we use the alien parasite trope so much in media? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, the parasites we have on Earth can be a huge pain to deal with. Ever been bitten by a mosquito? That's a parasite. Ever gotten head lice? That's a parasite. Ever had to deal with athlete's foot or jock itch? That's a parasite. Other parasites that feed on humans include tapeworms, leeches, bedbugs, ticks, and even some microbes that spread infectious disease, like the Plasmodium microbe that causes malaria. There are also dozens of parasites that don't affect humans but do affect the plants and animals we often take for granted. Witchweed is a parasitic plant that feeds on corn and sugarcane plants, and heartworm is a parasite that burrows into the bodies of dogs and cats, often leading to their death. Therefore, the mere idea of a parasitic species that feeds on humans reminds us of itchy mosquito bites, disgusting leeches, and the diseases that kill our plants, our animals, and sometimes even ourselves. In fact, that's also probably where the fear of vampires comes from. Second, even the parasites that don't affect humans tend to have brutal methods that, because we tend to project human morality onto animals, we view as cruel and heartless. Take the tongue-eating louse, a parasitic isopod that cuts off a fish's tongue and attaches itself to the tongue stub to serve as a prosthesis for the organ it severed while feeding on the fish's blood. I'm sure many of you wince just hearing about that. Another example is the ichneumoniid family of wasps, who inject their eggs into the bodies of other insects, usually larval insects, causing these eggs to hatch inside the body and eat the host from the inside. These creatures are considered so brutal by humans that their existence caused Charles Darwin to have a crisis of faith. As he wrote in a letter in 1860,
I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have decidedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars.
Therefore, it's only natural that, when asked to make a new threatening creature to terrorize the protagonist, creature designers would look at organisms like these, which do cruel and unusual things to their host, and imagine, what if something like this preyed upon humans? Third, we humans are a social species, hardwired to find strength in friendship. Thus, one of our most common and persistent fears is someone taking advantage of us, using a kind facade to draw us in, only to use us as a stepping stone for their own personal gain. We even see this fear in the stories we tell. Hansel and Gretel is one of the standout examples of this. The witch invites Hansel and Gretel into her house and tells them they can eat as much as they want, but then it's revealed that she's fattening them up so she can kill and eat them. And parasitic species need to take advantage of other species to eat and reproduce, so we naturally see their actions as scummy. In fact, parasites that affect the behavior of their host make a perfect metaphor for peer pressure. It's not you who's saying and doing these things, it's someone else telling you to say and do them. Fourth, and also tying into human behavior, we tend to expect partnerships and friendships to have benefits for both parties. We're more likely to mow someone's lawn if they say they'll pay us to do it. We're more likely to travel all the way to our friend's house if they tell us they have a cool new video game we can play together. We're more likely to talk to our parents on a regular basis if our parents don't judge us for the career path we picked. And all in all, we're more likely to maintain friendships with people who are nice to us. There's a reason why treat others as you wish to be treated is considered the golden rule. By contrast, parasites, by definition, harm the organisms that they depend on for survival. They take and take and take without ever giving anything in return. Hence why we use words like parasite, leech, and bloodsucker to refer to someone who we perceive as doing the same. From a lazy roommate who won't do any household chores, to a billionaire who lives in luxury while the employees of his company can't even make a living wage, to those con artists who rope their childhood friends into multi-level marketing schemes. And finally, and tying into the previous 2 points, parasites make for great metaphors. Science fiction is chock full of stories that are metaphors for real-world issues. For example, War of the Worlds used the Martian invasion as a metaphor for colonialism. Strangers come to our land in search of natural resources and don't care how many people have to die in order for them to get it. And an alien species that is parasitic can very easily be compared to any outside force that can take over one's life. Peer pressure, collectivist societies, overly codependent romantic relationships, drug addiction, beauty trends, infectious disease, communism, you name it. However, that begs the question, is Nihilego a metaphor for anything? Now, I don't know if I'm the first one to make this connection, but I've noticed a lot of parallels between Nihilego and alcohol. First and foremost, let's look at the effects of Nihilego's toxins. Nihilego is repeatedly said to produce a neurotoxin, or a poison that affects the brain. In Pokemon Sun and Moon, if you ask Wick to give you information about Nihilego, she elaborates on what these neurotoxins do. According to her, Nihilego's neurotoxin is incredibly stimulating and inspires feelings of extreme excitement and a lack of inhibition in its host. In other words, anything or anyone that a Nihilego latches onto will have its native skills forcibly activated to their fullest extent and will then act as it naturally desires to. So it's not the kind of neurotoxin that just shuts your brain down. Instead, it removes your ability to think before you act, gives you feelings of excitement, and amplifies your true personality. And I don't know about you, but that kind of sounds like what alcohol does to you. Alcohol is well known for making people do things without thinking. We've all heard tons of stories about people getting really drunk and doing things that they would later end up regretting. It also tends to make people feel more excited, hence why it's usually served at parties. And the idea that everyone acts like their true, unfiltered self when drunk is a very old one. There are like 40 different proverbs from around the world that say that exact thing, with the most famous being the Latin phrase, in vino veritas. Second, let's examine Nihilego's effects on Lusamine. Lusamine became fascinated with Nihilego after the disappearance of her husband, and after being exposed to its neurotoxins, she became dependent on them. She became more short-tempered and cruel, especially towards her children, and began ignoring her responsibilities as a company president and single mother in order to fan the flames of her Nihilego obsession. She eventually leaves home and decides to spend the rest of her life in the ultra-deep sea, and once she's had far too much and is let go from Nihilego's grasp, she passes out. Now, you might notice a lot of parallels between this and many accounts of alcohol abuse. Becoming dependent on alcohol following the loss of a loved one, becoming more short-tempered and cruel towards one's family members, ignoring responsibilities in order to spend more time drinking, leaving home without warning and practically living at the local bar, even passing out after drinking too much. It makes so much sense. It reflects a common reality in any country with legal alcohol and any kind of drinking culture: the alcoholic parent. I know many of you out there know someone, or even are someone, whose mom or dad was a heavy drinker. And considering alcohol tends to be one of those things that E for Everyone games are forbidden from even offhandedly mentioning, see Vodka Drunkensky being changed to Soda Popinski, any commentary on that issue in the Pokemon franchise would have to be addressed through metaphor rather than directly. And finally, there's the matter of Nihilego being made out of glass. It seems like a fairly odd and random choice for this Pokemon, doesn't it? Why glass of all materials? Well, let me ask you this. What kind of container is liquor almost always stored in? That's right, glass bottles. Even as most other beverages have shifted to being stored in plastic bottles or jugs, alcoholic beverages have continued to be stored in glass bottles. And most alcoholic beverages are traditionally served in glass containers as well. We say a glass of wine for a reason. So when you take all of these factors into account, Nihilego is basically a living booze bottle. And I do enjoy a nice bottle of booze, so maybe that might contribute to why I like it so much. Of course, Nihilego equals alcohol is just my personal view of this Pokemon, and it could be, and has been, interpreted as a metaphor for many other things. For example, due to the aforementioned addiction parallels and effects its neurotoxins have on the brain, combined with the difficulty Lusamine faces in obtaining it and the fact that Lusamine's reaction after being separated from Nihilego is hauntingly similar to an OD, some have interpreted it as a metaphor for hard drugs. Alternatively, because Lusamine continuously refers to Nihilego as beautiful and forces Lily to dress like it, because it looks like a hat and long hair, and because Lusamine is shown to be very vain and often comments on people's clothes, Nihilego could be a metaphor for fashion trends or just beauty standards in general. Going off of that, I could also see Nihilego being a metaphor for cosmetic surgery, given Lusamine's vanity, how she always calls it beautiful, how it doesn't even have a face, symbolizing how cosmetic surgery can make your face unrecognizable, and how it makes people look like they have longer hair, which could be a reference to hair transplants. It could even be a metaphor for an extramarital affair. She gravitates towards it when her husband is gone, is always complimenting its appearance, ignores her and her husband's children to spend time with it, and abruptly leaves her house to crash at its house and have it put its mouth all over her. And of course, it could just be a Lovecraft-style story about someone who becomes obsessed with an eldritch being without any fancy metaphors involved. We can't be sure on what Game Freak's intentions were, and all we can do is analyze what we see in Pokemon media. And on the topic of analyzing what we see in Pokemon media, there is one specific piece of Pokemon media featuring a Nihilego that I want to talk about. Pokemon Journeys, Episode 111, The Homecoming Crown. During Generation 7, Nihilego was often portrayed as an antagonistic force and shown in a negative light. It's framed as the sole reason for Lusamine getting worse, is the first of the Ultra Beasts encountered and is thus portrayed explicitly as a threat, and in the anime is responsible for Lily's fear of touching Pokemon. We didn't know whether it could really feel empathy outside of the Pokemon refresh mechanics that apply to all Pokemon for gameplay purposes. We didn't know exactly how intelligent Nihilego was, though judging by the fact that it didn't seem to have a brain, most of us assumed not very. And we didn't know exactly what the Pokédex meant when it said it behaved like a young girl. However, in Generation 8, we got some insight into what Nihilego behaved like, as instead of a mindless monster who exists to swoop up a woman and float off to another dimension, the episode The Homecoming Crown depicts a Nihilego who is an actual character, and gives it some actual redeeming qualities. In the episode, Lusamine, Lily, and Gladion find Moan living in a cottage in the Crown Tundra, with a bad case of amnesia. He then introduces them to his daughter, also named Lily, who, as it turns out, is a shiny Nihilego using illusions to make itself look like his daughter. The family tries to tell them that his so-called daughter isn't even a human and that they're his real family, but he doesn't remember a thing. He doesn't even recognize his own face. It's also shown that there are no mirrors in his house and every reflective surface has been dirtied. You'd expect this story to have the plot point of, this evil Nihilego is mind-controlling him and that's why he can't remember his own face. But the actual story turns out to be a lot more heartwarming. This shiny Nihilego saved his life and nursed him back to health after he fell through that ultra wormhole. By looking into his memories, it found out about his daughter and used its powers to make him see it as her, presumably in order to make it seem like he's living a normal life. Noticing another wormhole, it brought Moan back to his world and lived with him as his child. It soon began to care so deeply about Moan that it dirtied the windows and removed the mirrors to prevent him from realizing who he is and leaving it forever. In this episode, we see an unexpected cleverness in Lily the Nihilego, showing that it's intuitive enough to figure out the connection between Moan seeing his reflection and remembering who he is, and intelligent enough to figure out how to play a piano piece with chords and everything. Either it's playing it by ear, which is impressive, or it knows how to read sheet music, which is even more impressive. We also see that Nihilego can create illusions, which finally gives us an explanation for the disappearing and reappearing that Nihilego tends to do in Sun and Moon, as well as an explanation for that weird little blurb they put on the Sun and Moon website before the game's release that said that Nihilego can assume different shapes and forms. In addition, we see that this Nihilego craves attention from others, hence why it forced Moan to keep living with it and giving it attention. This was a common headcanon that people had about Nihilego back during Gen 7, even I had that headcanon, and it's really nice to see it reflected in canon. I guess the reason both the fans and the anime writers got this idea independently of each other is due to the comparisons many people draw between very clingy people and parasites. It also finally establishes what they mean when they say Nihilego acts like a young girl. A desire for attention is a very common trait among young children. I should know. My first job was as a summer camp counselor. Taught me a lot of things about child behavior. But most importantly, we see that Nihilego have the capacity for empathy, and for others outside their species no less. This Nihilego saw a human man falling from the sky, and without hesitation or expectation of anything in return, it caught him. It then brought him through another wormhole to his home dimension, found a house for them to take residence in, and healed him, somehow. Nihilego can't learn any healing moves, so I find it odd that they gave it this ability. Maybe it used Pain Split? Anyhow, this Nihilego, whom he gave the name Lily, devoted the rest of its life to keeping him company and never took him as a parasitic host. We never know if Lily's sense of empathy is unusual among its species or not, but we do see from its example that Nihilego are not an aggressive species. Hashtag not all Nihilego! The episode concludes with Moan being shown his reflection and remembering who he was before, addressing his family members by name and embracing them. Lily the Nihilego, saddened, turns away and leaves, but then Lily the human suggests it stay with them. This is a huge sign of character growth for Lily, because even though a Nihilego traumatized her as a child, she's gotten over that fear and is now holding this Nihilego's hand without issue. Moan agrees with Lily, because the Nihilego did save his life and by bringing him back to his home dimension, allow him to reunite with his family. So Gladian catches it in a beast ball and it becomes a member of the family. How sweet! There's even official art of the two Lilies playing piano together. And in the very next episode, we see Gladian using Lily the Nihilego in a battle royal, only for it to be the first one knocked out. Honestly, if I was Gladian and I had a Pokemon that could play the piano surprisingly well despite not having fingers, I wouldn't send it out in a battle. I'd keep it on the sidelines and have it play Giorno's theme whenever I'm in a pinch. The final thing I wanted to point out about this Nihilego is the fact that it's often seen holding a bouquet of white lilies. Obviously, it's a pun on its name, Lily, but if you know about the language of flowers, you'll know that white lilies symbolize purity, innocence, virtue, sweetness, and familial love. It's the reason why you so often see them in biblical art, and why in Catholicism they're often associated with Saint Joseph, the patron saint of families. And just to be 100% sure the Japanese writers of the anime knew this and I'm not just projecting Western symbolism onto an Eastern show, I looked up what white lilies meant in Hanakotoba, the Japanese language of flowers, and wouldn't you know, white lilies are associated with purity and innocence over there too. This is a subtle way of indicating the innocent and virtuous nature of this Nihilego, and how deeply it cares about its adoptive father. I just love when flower symbolism is incorporated into fiction. But I know what you're thinking. Yeah, that's all well and good. Nihilego's got a lot of lore and depth to it, but like, is it any good in battle? Well, I'm glad you asked. For many years, Nihilego has served me well as a battler. Usually against in-game NPCs, but sometimes against other people. Now, I don't play competitively, so I'm not expecting you to take my advice to VGC. I'm just here to tell you, very generally, what kind of niches it can fill on your team. Nihilego is a rock poison type, a rare and unique type combo. Or at least it was unique, but then Glimora happened. I mean, really? Another rock poison type that looks like it should be another type and lives in the otherworldly location where you go during the game's climax to fight the main antagonist? Be more creative, Game Freak. But anyways, this typing gives it resistances to flying, bug, normal, fire, fairy, and its own poison type. Sadly though, it's weak to psychic, steel, water, and especially ground, which becomes a headache if you want to use it competitively because so many people use ground types and ground type moves in competitive play. Even in in-game battles, I've had to constantly watch out for Pokemon that know Earthquake. Fortunately, if you know what you're doing, or you give your Nihilego a Shuka Berry or an Air Balloon, you won't find its ground weakness to be that crippling. Looking at its stats, it has a base stat total of 570, like all the other Ultra Beasts sans Poipole and Naganadel. Its lowest stat is defense, fair, it's made of glass, followed closely by attack, fair, it's got no hands with which to punch people. However, it's got good HP, good speed, and great special stats. Special defense is its best stat, which is a bit odd considering its defense is so low, but when you realize that special defense is how well you're able to defend against more magical and mental attacks, it makes sense. You can't shatter glass with your mind, you can't destroy it with a magic spell, and you can't break it with sound unless you're a very, very good singer. Like all Ultra Beasts, it has the ability Beast Boost, which raises its highest stat every time it knocks a Pokemon out, so that special defense stat is only gonna get higher and higher. You know, provided you know what you're doing and don't send it out against something it's weak to. Moving on to its move pool, its level up moves are mostly normal, rock, or poison, but it can learn electric, psychic, dark, ghost, steel, fairy, and even grass type moves via TM and move tutoring. The grass move that it learns, Grass Knot, is especially useful in competitive play because it gives Nihilego a counter against ground types. Now, I have never taught Grass Knot to any of my Nihilego, but I hear it's very useful. A good template for your Nihilego's moveset, in my eyes, is Toxic Spikes or Stealth Rock, Stab Rock type special move of your choice, Stab Poison type special move of your choice, and a free space for you to put whatever move you want. Both Toxic Spikes and Stealth Rock are moves that affect any new opponent sent out, and which one you want to use depends on your playstyle. Do you want to poison them and do damage slowly over time, or just deal damage as soon as they are sent out? Now personally, I prefer to use Stealth Rock, but that's just my get it done attitude. When it comes to its rock type special move, I've historically tended to use Power Gem, but in Gen 8 it can learn Meteor Beam, a very powerful move that also boosts special attack via Move Tutor. However, you also have to keep in mind that Meteor Beam takes 2 turns to complete and has lower accuracy than Power Gem. For a poison type special move, I think Sludge Bomb is a good option, but if you have a Toxic Spikes Nihilego, use Venoshock to take advantage of that poisoning. And for the final move, you could put another rock type or poison type move, or a status move, but as of right now, I usually go for a move of another type in order to cast its net wider and deal with types it's weak to. Also, here's a tip from me. Do not let your Nihilego learn Head Smash! You usually catch it at level 60-ish, and it learns Head Smash in its early 70s, so if you've managed to settle into using a Nihilego, you will soon get that little blurb that says, Nihilego wants to learn Head Smash! However, it already knows 4 moves! Should a move be forgotten to make room for Head Smash? And I am begging you, say no! Say keep old moves! First of all, it's a recoil damage move, which are hard sells because in order for the move to break even, its wielder ideally needs to have the stats and stab to beef it up. And second, it's a physical move. Nihilego's physical attack stat is not very good, so it's very risky to give it a physical attacking move. And I know that Head Smash is a very high base power, but I just think that its nature as a physical move and its recoil damage are risks that far outweigh the potential reward. But regardless of how you're using it against NPCs and non-professional battlers, you should be fine as long as you don't lean too heavily into its physical learn set, and don't send it out against types you know it's weak to. It has a base stat total of 570. That's more than any starter Pokemon. You'll be fine. Of course, a major factor involved in choosing one's favorite Pokémon is sentimentality and nostalgia. Nostalgia plays a key role in the selection of a lot of our favorite things. Many people's favorite foods are foods that their parents or grandparents would often cook for them when they were growing up. Many people's favorite movies are movies they first saw when they were like 8 and whose characters they had a lot of toys of when they were kids. Many people's favorite songs are songs that they heard on the radio when they were younger. And if you ask around, many people's favorite Pokemon are Pokemon from games that came out when they still weren't old enough to watch R-rated movies. In fact, a lot of people's favorite Pokemon just happen to be their first ever starter Pokemon. Now, I was introduced to Pokemon during Generation 4, so you'd expect my favorite to be a Generation 4 Pokemon. And to be fair, before the release of Sun and Moon, it was. Dialga was my favorite Pokemon before I discovered Nihilego, and even today, it's a pretty close second favorite. However, I was only a passive Pokemon enjoyer and primarily consumed Pokemon content through the anime, trading cards, and those little guidebooks they sold at Scholastic book fairs. I didn't get deep into Pokemon until I was around 10, during Generation 5, when I finally started playing the games. I started with Soul Silver, which is why Cyndaquil is my third favorite, and then I played White, the most recent Pokemon game at the time, and by that point, I was obsessed. So once I started 5th grade, I was a full-on Pokemaniac. However, the thing about 5th graders is that it's the point in time when kids start wanting to be more like teenagers. So while I had many friends who shared my love of Pokemon in 5th grade, I also had classmates who made fun of Pokemon to my face because they thought it was too childish. And things only got worse from there. During middle school, hating on Pokemon became a common practice, and even though I had a small group of friends I could talk to about Pokemon, and I was still keeping up with the Pokemon games as they came out, I was bullied for publicly talking about Pokemon and had to hold my tongue in front of people who didn't sit at my lunch table for fear of further bullying. But then, once I made the move from middle school to high school, several things changed. First of all, I enrolled in a program that would allow me to go to a different high school on the other side of town in order to take specialized classes. My middle school best friend also enrolled in that program. So while all my middle school classmates got filtered into one school, me and my best friend went to a completely different school where barely anyone knew who we were. It was a fresh start, a blank slate. All of our old bullies were far away from us, barely anyone knew about our past embarrassments, and because the specialized classes we enrolled in were mostly focused on digital media, there was a big clique of gamers that we could wriggle our way into. In fact, on our first day, we saw that a student had put up a flyer saying, "It's dangerous to go alone, take one of these," and a bunch of little tear-off swords, and when we saw that, we knew we were in the right place. Second, I had learned to keep my head down. In elementary and middle school, I was loud, chatty, and kind of obnoxious. So it's only natural that I'd get picked on because I was putting myself out there so much. But in high school, I'd largely gotten that all out of my system and was much quieter and more reserved. Therefore, not many people singled me out as someone to be bullied because most of the bullies didn't even notice I was there. And third, during the summer before my freshman year, Pokemon Go exploded in popularity, and significantly reduced the stigma around liking Pokemon past the age of 10. Because it was on a device that you were socially expected to have and could help you get in shape, people of all ages, even those who had never touched Pokemon before, played it and, if only temporarily, enjoyed it. So throughout high school, I wore Pokemon t-shirts and talked about Pokemon openly to my classmates, and I rarely, if ever, got bullied for it. So, because of all these compounding factors, I had a very easy time in high school. I wasn't popular, I didn't get crowned prom queen, I didn't play any sports, I didn't get a lead role in any of the school plays, but I was still very happy. I wasn't picked on much, I got good grades, and I had a great support network of friends. I know that the whole adage about high school being the best 4 years of your life isn't true for the majority of people, and I've known many people in my age group who have had awful experiences in high school. But for some reason, the planets aligned in such a way that my high school experience ended up less like Heather's and more like Saved by the Bell. The 7th generation of Pokemon couldn't have been more perfectly timed. It began during my freshman year of high school, when I didn't have to worry about rent, or car payments, or finding a job, or even college applications. and it wrapped up during senior year, which was the most stressful year of high school for me due to the looming shadow of college and the unexpected major historical event that canceled my senior prom. And the games themselves were not only themed around outer space, a subject I've been fascinated by since I was 6. Heck, for my sweet 16, my family took me to the Kennedy Space Center. But the region was based on Hawaii, which, thanks to a trip I took there when I was 11 with my brother and second cousins who were also big Pokemon fans, already had associations with my Pokemon memories in my mind. It hit a lot of points of nostalgia for me back then, and because it came out during a good time in my life, it would end up gaining nostalgic associations on its own merit. When I look back on Sun, Moon, Ultra Sun, and Ultra Moon, when I replay the games or watch Let's Plays of them or listen to the music, I think about my high school days and I get wistful. I think about all the lunchtime conversations, all the doodles I made in my spiral notebook during class. I think about the D&D club and the elf wizard character I made, about the underclassmen play where I played a clown and I mispronounced a word in the script but the director thought it was funny so I kept mispronouncing it in all subsequent rehearsals and performances. I think about that medal I won in dramatic interpretation during a speech and debate meet, about the language arts classes where I was introduced to the masterpieces of William Shakespeare. I think about the numerous animation and video production projects my best friend and I had to do in our specialized courses, including that green screening myself into the ultra deep sea thing that I mentioned all the way at the beginning of the video. I think about the 4 homecoming dances I went to, about the red carpet they laid out for the students to walk over, about taking a free rose from this little basket full of roses that they had and gripping it between my teeth like a flamenco dancer, about dancing while considering making a webcomic based on this Mega Man fanfic idea I had because it's not like Capcom has been doing anything with the franchise lately, and then 2 months later Mega Man 11 was announced, making me feel like that guy who called the Titanic unsinkable. I think about my one and only prom, from the adorable promposal my high school beau gave me, to the gorgeous blue dress my mother bought for me, to the bowling alley where it was hosted. And most of all, I think about my dear friends, some of whom I've probably linked this video to. Thanks, guys. You mean a lot to me. So basically, in my mind, everything from Generation 7 is painted with this brush of, God, I miss being 16 years old. And Nihilego, of course, is no exception. In conclusion, Nihilego is a spectacular Pokemon, with a beautiful design, great battle capabilities, intriguing lore, and so many layers of inspiration and metaphor that went into it. I don't think the Pokemon Company will ever make a Pokemon that strikes me as profoundly as Nihilego does. And even if they do make one that is exactly my brand, Nihilego still has the advantage of high school adjacent nostalgia and will therefore probably never be toppled. Of course, every Pokemon is someone's favorite, and I'm sure all of you have your own explanations for why your favorite Pokemon is your favorite Pokemon. It could be a 4-hour analysis of all the symbolism behind it, or just a simple statement of, I think it's super cute. And that's the best thing about Pokemon. With so many creatures to catch and discover, you're bound to find at least one that you really, really like. Anyhow, thanks for listening to me ramble about my favorite Pokemon. If you liked the video, or are just impressed by my cool hat, be sure to like and subscribe. And tell me what your favorite Pokemon is in the comments and why it's your favorite. I'd love to know. Until next time, stay stylish.